Okay, so the next speaker is Lynn Hogg, and Lynn is going to be talking about the intersection between intimate partner violence and brain injury. So this is one of those situations where we're going to get some information and discussion about the long-lasting impacts in a particular area. She's going to talk about the work that she's doing. She is a PhD candidate and contract faculty member with the Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University, and a research trainee at the Acquired Brain Injury Research Lab at the University of Toronto. And as I said, her research explores the intersection of intimate partner violence and brain injury. So, Lynn, thank you very much for being with us here. And I'm sure sometime soon in the next few months, I'm not going to jinx anything, but look forward to calling you Dr. Hogg. But go ahead.
Thanks very much, Robin. Yeah, please don't jinx anything. But all things considered, it'll snuggle up to that Christmas decoration you have going on behind you, Amy. So it should be about the same time of year we can all celebrate something together. And I just want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today and come together with all of my colleagues here and talk about something that we really don't talk about very much. And is really it ties into what Christine sort of started off by saying. This is this ongoing condition that can really have an impact on folks for a long time. So I'm just going to follow the advice here and set a timer so I know what I'm doing. I think the sort of the thing that I really want to point out to folks is how this happens, how often it happens, and then leave you with a quick glance at something that we developed to support folks. So I talk about the perfect storm effect. And what I'm referring to there is that we know that the most likely form of physical violence in an intimate partner violence encounter, over 92% of assaults will include hits to the head, face, or neck, including strangulation. And the most likely type of injury to be sustained after that kind of assault, short of broken facial bones or surface bruising, cuts, and abrasions, the most likely type of injury to occur from that kind of assault is an injury to the brain itself. Quite similar to what folks might think about in terms of concussion injury or car accident, folks who've been through a car accident who might suffer a mild to moderate traumatic brain injury. And these injuries can come both from physical hits to the head, face, and neck, but they can also come from strangulation as well. The most likely type of resultant damage to the brain would be in very specific areas. And those areas would be the sorts of things that control, in many cases, control the executive functions. So when we talk about executive functions, we're talking about things like planning skills, organization skills, the ability to multitask, decision-making, emotional stability, impulse control. All of those kinds of things are controlled by the areas of the brain that we would expect to see damage in with that kind of physical assault. And the sort of the piece that plays in for that that's really, I think, is really critical is that if you think about all the things that are needed in order to plan and execute an exit strategy safely and effectively for women, in many ways, these skills may very well be part of that, those sort of necessary skills in order to be able to do that. And they may very well be cognitively, physically impaired in a way that almost nobody that she's going to come up into contact with is going to understand, recognize, and know how to support. So for these women, really what we're seeing is a lack of awareness in the community, in the healthcare community, in the IPV support community, traditionally, in just about any context that you might think that they might be finding themselves in. That is changing. We've been doing this work now for 8 to 10 years. And I'm very happy to say that the needle is moving. You know, I personally have had the opportunity to speak with a couple of organizations locally. I support our brain injury organization locally doing some IPV work. So we are moving the needle, but it's like everything, it's painfully slow and we've still got a lot of work to do. The second sort of piece of statistical information that I like to give folks is I think one of the most shocking parts about this, and that is just how often does it happen. And the reality is that the research that we have to date, which is very minimal, but the research that we have to date suggests that up to 75% of all women survivors of physical intimate partner violence have probable brain injuries as a result of that exposure. So when you just go back and do a quick calculation on that, if you think about Christine's or Jen's number, about 1 in 3 Canadian women can expect to experience intimate partner violence over their lifetime. If I take 75% of those women and calculate that out, I come up with 1 in 8 Canadian women have probable brain injury as a result of exposure to intimate partner violence. And I think the aside from the fact that that statistic is shockingly high, the piece that always sort of comes home for people is that 1 in 8 is the same statistic as breast cancer in this country. So we're talking about the same percentage of the population are experiencing probable brain injury as a result of exposure to violence as are experiencing breast cancer. And I think one of the reasons why I really like to bring that home for folks is that if you just take a second and think about all the things that we know about breast cancer, all the research that goes into it, all the funding dollars that go into it, all the support systems we have in place, the diagnostic, the treatment, the lack of stigma attached to breast cancer, and none of those things should change. So I'm not saying for a second that that's a bad thing, but all of those resources and supports and options, none of them exist for this particular group of survivors. So I think, one of the things that I do, I take absolutely every opportunity I can find to have even, the quickest of conversations around this particular intersection, because I think I agree entirely that education is the way forward. If we can get folks aware of the intersection itself at all, and then start training the frontline workers, start training medical care to recognize, to have a sense of what are the next steps, where do we go, how do we support, what do we do? I think that's where we can start to move forward and change this. And for me, while I wouldn't say that intimate partner violence is only a healthcare concern, because I think too often we like to nudge things into healthcare and then they get lost in a bigger conversation. So I'm careful about that. I certainly would argue that this is absolutely partially a healthcare issue, and that until we reframe it that way, we really aren't going to see a lot of movement. So I think that is a very important conversation to be had. And I'm very pleased to be able to bring that today. The other part that I would like to be able to do is just to take a quick minute and show you something that we built at the research lab in Toronto. And that is a toolkit, an online web-based toolkit that we designed to support frontline workers in their efforts to recognize traumatic brain injury amongst their client population. As well, we've now expanded that into other sectors and other contexts, because we've found that a lot of folks were coming to us from the healthcare perspective. Particularly, we've started work with legal professionals as well, trying to just, again, raise awareness, but also to be able to give you some tools in what to do. You can find this at www.abitoolkit.ca. It's freely available. All the resources on here, they're free for you to use. You can download them, you can share them. We talk about using the toolkit as a sort of a means of communication for folks when they're working with somebody who's a survivor who they think may or may not have a brain injury. Oftentimes we hear from frontline, I don't want to diagnose, that's not my job. And my response to that is absolutely not. And I don't need you to diagnose. I just need you to be aware of the challenges that this woman might be facing that will be interfering with her ability to access the services that you're actually providing. So one of the analogies that I give folks is, if you were helping somebody who had to use a wheelchair to walk, you wouldn't ask her to stand up and cross the room in order to be able to talk to you. And what happens, unfortunately, is that when you try to communicate with someone who may have cognitive impairments and you're not aware of them, the conversation that you're having isn't going to get through effectively, because there are challenges and barriers to that communication process that you're just not aware of. So if you sort of think about that wheelchair and walking kind of picture, it translates into what I'm talking about here. So just a really quick sprint across the toolkit, you can see that we have here the traumatic brain injury section. So if you click on that, it takes you to the traumatic brain injury section where you can then get all the information that you might need about traumatic brain injury, what are its signs and symptoms, what are the effects, what does it mean to have repetitive exposure to them, things like that. We have a glossary of terms, sort of basic stuff like that. Then for folks who started to come to us from different sectors and say, you know, we needed intimate partner violence information, we figured out how to provide that for them as well. As well here, because we're not intimate partner violence specialists, we're brain injury specialists, we felt it was really important to link out to projects that could provide that kind of specialized intimate partner violence piece. So those are here as well. This section on supporting survivors was specifically designed for frontline workers. And we thought about all the sorts of conversations that were really important. What did you really need to understand about brain injury and about this particular group of survivors in order to be able to adequately support them? So we have lots of different conversations here as well, including where might you refer and what might that look like. So we actually give a detailed description of, well, what is an occupational therapist? What do they do? And what might that look like for support for a survivor? You'll see on the far right over here that there is a section on, if I do this, I think I can move that out of the way. There we go. There's our resource library. That's a new addition in the 2.0 version that we have here. It was updated earlier this year. And you can see we have a video library here where we have lots of short videos on various topics, including the snowball effect, which happens to be a video comprised of firsthand reports and comments that was gathered during research processes. And those are from survivors and frontline workers themselves. So we wanted to provide their voice and give them an opportunity for them to tell their stories in ways that were meaningful. So we put that one together as well. You see here, you can have access to all the latest research. We have downloadable information sheets that you can print and take away. You can use in your own organizations, whatever works. And then here at the bottom of this, for every province in the country, for every province and territory, we have various brain injury services. So just as a general trick, we'll see what happens when we click on Kitchener. And of course, what'll happen is services that exist won't be there, because that's always what happens when I run this little test somewhere. But now if you scroll down, you can see here that there are various brain injury association options for support. So we at least tried to provide somewhere for everybody to be able to go to have a look and see what was local to them, so that folks on the front line would have a sense of what might be available in your community. When the last thing that I want to sort of touch on, and that is that one of the things that I get asked a lot is, well, what can we do in our organization? And the answer really is you can do a lot with very little cost involved. So you can change the lighting in your organization so that you've got a softer lighting. Make sure that when you're talking to survivors, there's minimal amounts of noise and background noise and distractions available to them. Have conversations that are short and to the point. Make lists, help them with memory functions, that kind of thing. And I think those sorts of things, they sound like they're these little tiny things, but they actually can make a big difference in the lives of these women. And I think it's important we have a lot of those on the toolkit. You can find information like that. And so you really have at your fingertips there a chance to get as educated as you need to be or want to be. You can read all of the articles that I've read up to date. As well, you can just skim across the top and find out, I've got somebody who's coming in that in 5 minutes, and all I have is 5 minutes to sort of get a quick answer to something, and that's there too. So that's what we tried to do, and I hope that it's helpful for folks. If you have questions or you need help with it in any way, please reach out, and I'm around.
Okay, Lynn, thank you very much for that, Lynn. And certainly, when we talk about brain injury, it's that it's like that unseen. You don't really see someone with a brain injury. It's like depression. You don't see depression, or pain. You don't see pain, but scars you see, other things you see. And so it's so important to recognize that there is a large unseen injury here that you're dealing with and to be attuned to that. One of the things we talked about, which I thought was interesting, because when we were having conversations prior to tonight, we talked about those situations where, hockey players or football players, their brains are donated to a brain bank and examined or whatever. You mentioned something about, was it the pink brain
The
bank?
pink brains, yeah.
Could you just
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about that?
well, it's part of the challenge with repeated exposure to brain injuries, and we see this in football players and in soccer players, hockey players. The disease that was being referred to as chronic traumatic encephalitis (CTE), and it's repeated exposure to very significant head injuries, and it causes a sort of an early onset deterioration that can end in violence and self-harm and suicide. So it's been in the news for quite some time. And there have been brains from athletes that have been donated because unfortunately you can only diagnose this post-mortem, so after death. And so they were doing a brain bank of male athletes to be able to get more evidence and more information on this. And those of us in the IPV brain injury research field were obviously interested in this particular issue. Most of us would say we would expect to see some kind of similar condition. What that's called, what it looks like, we don't know. But we've recently been able to start up a pink brain pledge where we're looking for women survivors to make the pledge to donate their brain to these very specific research organizations in order to be able to follow this up. So it's very, very early days. I think we've had 2 or 3 perhaps to do original study on. There's very little information out there, but we are starting to look. And if you were interested in the Pink Brain Pledge, you could find it at pinkconcussions.com .com. Pink Concussions is an organization in the US that is interested in women's experiences of brain injury. And there's a specific task force on partner inflicted brain injury that we started a few years ago. And it's through that organization that the Pink Brain Pledge can be accessed.
Thank you very much for your comments and presentation. Okay, now I'd like to turn it over to David Morneau. David is a lawyer practicing law for over 20 years. He's accredited as a family mediator and collaborative legal professional. A collaborative legal professional is one that is looking to resolve issues without necessarily going to trial. And I think it's very important, particularly in the family law realm, that there's people that are experienced and dedicated to trying to resolve things that way. David has been a passionate advocate for legal reform and spoken about the legal system and its intersection with human sex trafficking and family violence. So, David, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
First of all, thank you very much, Rob, for asking me to speak alongside with such an incredible panel of advocates and experts. I'm going to start my clock too. And thank you to this group for providing such diverse and enlightening information. And I know that there are more out there. Some of you may be watching who are doing the same. So thank you very much for what you do as well. Something like this requires a community collaborative effort. And as I begin, I'm reminded by the words you see behind me, it starts with me. So just a bit about me. I'm David Morneau, and I have been very fortunate to work as a family lawyer in this community for nearly 25 years now. You will note that I embrace reform and innovation, which is needed in many of our systems. That said, I'll stick to what I know tonight and talk about the intersection between family law and family violence and family law. So my intention is ambitious here, I'll be honest, and I hope to provide as much as I can in the allotted time. This is definitely meant to be high level, and my plan is to cover first defining family violence and its application in family law, and then working towards a safer justice system. So let's begin with defining family violence and its application in family law. So Although there had long been an intersection between domestic violence and family law, it wasn't until 2021 that the federal and provincial governments legislated an actual definition. Prior to this, the approach was more or less, we will know it when we see it, which usually meant that there had to be some level of police involvement, police reports, charges, convictions, medical reports, or an eyewitness. In that, it didn't really pay much attention to what some, including myself, and what I heard Sarah say earlier, believe is the more insidious form of violence and coercive control. And then we came to sections 2 sub 1 of the Divorce Act and 18 sub 1 and sub 2 of the Children's Law Reform Act, which created almost identical definitions at both levels of government, identifying family violence as any conduct, whether or not it constitutes a criminal offense, by a family member towards another family member that is violent or threatening or constitutes a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior, or that causes that other family member to fear for their own safety or that of another person. And in the case of a child, the direct or indirect exposure to such conduct. So this was the most expansive definition that the family justice system had ever seen, and crystallized different forms of violence as well, including physical, sexual, psychological, and financial abuse, forced confinement, harassment, stalking, threats to kill or cause bodily harm to a person, and threats to kill or harm an animal or damage property, or actually doing so, because these were identified through the research as antecedents of escalating levels of violence, that we needed to recognize these things, even though they didn't involve an individual. It was important to recognize what the research was telling us. So then, applying this definition, the legislators analyzed factors to be considered when determining what is in the best interests of the child, where we are directed to look at family violence and its impact. And then finally, in this analysis, we are guided to look at factors relating to the impact of family violence, including its nature, seriousness, and frequency, patterns of coercive and controlling behavior, whether the violence is directed towards the child or the child is directly or indirectly exposed to the violence, physical, emotional, and psychological harm or risk of harm to the child, any compromise to the safety of the child or other family member. And then it asks questions like, does the child or other family member fear for their own safety, or the safety of the other person? Have steps been taken by the causer of harm to prevent further violence and improve their ability to care for the needs of the child? And then, Rob, as we're used to in law, the any other relevant factor, which leaves it open, at least for research as it develops, for courts to identify things where there may be gaps in the law. Now, I'll definitely say that this definition and its application are not perfect, but when you compare it to the fact that we didn't have any guidance at all before this is a huge step. So creating the definition and acknowledging the behavior and its impact is important, but those who have witnessed or experienced family courts may attest the system can be violent and incendiary. It's adversarial in nature and tends to be zero-sum in its approach. The system tends to be retributive, punitive, and reactive, which, from my perspective, can actually cause more danger. It doesn't encourage accountability for fear of consequences. The system is predicated on this concept of winning, whatever that means. And quite frankly, despite its best intentions, the system can lack expertise, particularly when it comes to violence. And this is an interesting tidbit that many people don't know. Certainly people who aren't, even people who are in the legal profession, that in Ontario, an accredited family mediator and most collaborative professionals are required to have extensive and ongoing intimate partner violence and coercive control training. But lawyers operating within the court system, which, based on my observations, I would argue tends to be higher emotion and conflict, do not. And I want you to think about that for a moment. This is not meant to espouse one means of resolution over another. What I'm trying to do is underscore and illustrate a significant deficiency that, from my perspective, is entirely correctable. And even judges were not required to have specialized training until Kira's Law, which is Bill C-233, named after 4-year-old Kira Kagan, who was killed by her father during a visit. This is now passed Senate and will require judges to have current and ongoing training for intimate partner violence and coercive control. In Kira's situation, there were an abundance of red flags, and Jennifer and I have become acquaintances and friends as time has gone on. Kira's father demonstrated, Jen Hutton had referred to risk factors, 22 risk factors, which risk factors, if there's proper domestic violence screening within the court process, can be recognized and acknowledged. And separation is actually one of the risk factors, and not, from what I've seen in my career, actually can escalate the potential for violence. He had 22. 7 or higher would suggest that a death is predictable and preventable. He had 3 times that amount. So I took and I continue to take ongoing training in intimate partner violence and coercive control, and can say that I learned so much, including I didn't know what I didn't know, which I think is sometimes more important than what we do know, which led me to connect with the various resources in our communities and beyond. Proper education and thoughtful planning is essential. I've been very, very vocal and unequivocal that everyone working within the family justice system needs this training, whether they're in court or not. And then there are some other emerging areas of violence and concern, including the growth in litigation abuse, the impact on children who have experienced violence, including becoming victims or causers of harm themselves, serious illness and premature death as adults, which again is not something that necessarily is on the radar, but there's plenty of evidence and research to demonstrate the correlative connection between the two. And for that, I just want to stop and pause and thank the Child Witness Center. I know that a couple are, I think Robin and Ryan are out there, for providing me with some of this information for this presentation and for what they do for children in our communities. And if you don't know who they are, please look them up. They're a vital resource for children who have experienced violence in our communities. And then there's also post-separation abuse, which Jen, I'm sure everybody sitting on this panel has seen as well. And what I would say is, if you have a chance, take a look. This post-separation abuse wheel is available in different colors and online, but it talks about the different areas where abuse can be applied in the separation context. So all that said, we're an intelligent community. The change and making things safer is completely within our grasp. You know, if I see myself as the person that helps to start the conversation, I'm happy to share my ideas within the family justice system and how we can make it better for anyone who might be interested. I'll put up my contact information in a second. And I've also left some resource materials with Reagan, if anybody's interested as well. Plug for myself, I can put together customized educational programs around navigating conflict. It's not just limited to separation and divorce, although I've done quite a bit of that, but all of this is meant to empower. We need to move to a stage where we're empowering more. And again, if anybody's interested, there's my contact info. And with that, I just want to say thank you for listening, and thank you for everything that everybody does.
Thank you, Dave. I know there's a lot of stuff in there, and I appreciate you going through that. And also the information about offering your resources as an education source. You know, I can certainly imagine some places that would like to have someone like yourself come in and help educate their people. I just wanted to touch base. It's going to sort of combine the question from Charlotte about mediation. It's that whole thing about trial, and you know, I know, I mean, nobody wants to go to trial generally, because it's such an intense experience, as you mentioned, and the potential harms that come from that too, and so much stress. And Charlotte was asked to pose the question. She thought everything was going to 100% mediation. What is the trend, or what's in the system overall with respect to trying to find an alternative way to resolve issues?
Sure. So first of all, I just wanted to correct Rob. Collaborative family law is its own process. It's
Right.
self-contained. It's outside of court. So you have to commit to that process. And what we've done is we involve lawyers don't like including other people. We involve family professionals and financial professionals. We bring them in. The idea is to work as a team, and it actually, in those circumstances. So now to the question, Charlotte's question about mediation, we're not moving towards 100% mediation. Now the law has changed things to recognize that mediation, when appropriate, should be canvassed by the legal advisor. What people fail to realize is that sometimes court is absolutely necessary. There is just no getting around it, but it shouldn't be the automatic in intimate partner violence and coercive control cases, because there is so much that can be done in a well-constructed process outside of the court that actually alleviates danger. And you actually have professionals who are attuned to screening and have ongoing training for intimate partner violence and domestic violence, or in coercive control. But we need to get away. People often think, well, there's violence here, it needs to go to court. The professionals outside the court system are actually more readily trained in that area and
Right.
ready to deal with it and bring in the right professionals to help people get through that, and get to where they need to go and move on with their lives.
Okay. All right, Dave, thank you very much for that. I'd like to go to our last speaker, Janet DeGazon. Janet is the gender-based violence lead at Camino Wellbeing and Mental Health. She coordinates and facilitates the Strong Moms Safe Kids group, supporting mothers who've experienced intimate partner violence and their children. She is the co-chair of the Waterloo Region Domestic Violence Service Coordination Committee and is a registered psychotherapist and child and youth worker. So Janet, thank you very much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
So yes, I'm here to represent Camino. And for those of you who aren't maybe familiar with Camino Wellbeing and Mental Health, we bring together the unified efforts of KW Counseling, Corizon, and Monica's Place. And so in April, we unified and became Camino as one organization, which allows us to really support folks in so many different ways, from birth to seniors, to community outreach. And we have specific supports for those who've experienced gender-based violence. I will talk about those specific supports in a moment, but I really wanted to spend some time tonight speaking from a place of building empathy and compassion and helping really highlight and shine light on the barriers to leaving an abusive relationship. Because I think when we can recognize the barriers, then we can work towards trying to break those barriers down. So I'm sharing with you here some input that was provided from folks who access support at Camino, survivors of abuse, when we were asking them a specific question. So often when people are in an abusive relationship, they're asked, why didn't you just leave? Or why didn't you leave sooner? And while that may come from a well-intentioned place, the person asking those questions may be concerned, or they care for somebody. That question can really come with a lot of judgment, and it can really be quite shaming. And it also places a lot of responsibility on the person who've experienced the abuse, as opposed to the person who's behaving abusively. So when we reframe that question and kind of shift it to be more compassionate and ask, what are the barriers to leaving? I know Sarah spoke on this a bit as well, or what would help you to be safer? Then we're speaking from a place of compassion. And I think this is really important to understand, because there's so many reasons why you may hear me say women often. That's who I tend to work with. And that is who is most often impacted by intimate partner violence. But there's many reasons why it's difficult to leave an abusive relationship. And there's also many reasons why sometimes it's not safe to leave at that time, and it is safer to stay. So these are some of the contributions that I'm sharing with consent from people who've accessed our support. And I've categorized these into some specific themes to break that down for you. So what comes up often is fear. And fear and children are on the same slide here intentionally because there's a lot of fear for the mothers in particular about what may happen to their children, whether they may lose access or custody, but also their child's safety if they're continuing to have unsupervised visits with the person who abused them. We know that abuse is rooted in fear, creating an environment where there is a lot of fear. And if we know this person has a history of behaving aggressively and then they're left alone with children, there's very valid reasons to be scared about their safety. And I'm not saying that always is the circumstance, but that can happen. As well, fear of being killed or harmed. We've talked a little bit tonight about some of those risk factors, and it's a very valid fear. Leaving is one of the most risky times, and so many people are very afraid for their life. This also comes with fear of change and the unknown. Change is hard, starting fresh. Partners may have made thoughts of suicide. That sometimes comes up. Folks, this kind of comes with this coercive control that was touched on a little bit earlier, but it's not uncommon for an abusive partner to threaten that they may commit suicide if they leave, if their partner leaves them. And so what an incredible responsibility to place on somebody. As well, children, a lot of mothers have reported that they care and they're concerned about the impact that this will have on their children, losing a loss of a relationship with another parent. They have that wish and hope that they could keep their family intact. And then we think about the barriers that they may face in providing for their children after leaving. As a single parent, especially in our economy, being able to provide food and shelter and meet basic needs, which kind of ties in with our next theme, which is lack of support. And this support can come emotionally and physically as well. So many folks report feeling a lot of judgment. And that question I kind of posed at the beginning really is an example of where that can begin. Why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? For those who are in members of faith groups, sometimes there's religious beliefs around divorce and separation. So fear of judgment or shame from their community, as well as friends or family. And money, I think that is a pretty clear barrier, but economic abuse is very common in an abusive relationship, which would involve controlling one's finances or their ability to have employment. And if you're trying to leave an abusive relationship, you need money, you need housing, you need to be able to provide for yourself, you need to be able to provide for your children. And in many cases, you need to access legal support. So you need to have the means to be able to do that. Another barrier is, I kind of encompass this all as mental health and well-being, because I think there's many of these points really fit in this broader category. But the biggest theme that women would share is just overall exhaustion and overwhelm. So if we're thinking from the survivor's experience and what they're enduring for a often long time, they are having their self-esteem and their self-worth diminished, and they're enduring the abuse, which on its own is exhausting. And then they are attempting to thrive and survive and carry on. So there's the emotional exhaustion of that. If they leave, there's the exhaustion of navigating the legal system, which David spoke about, how challenging that can be and how overwhelming that can feel. As well, Lynn, you spoke on if there has been brain injury, this added level of cognitive impairment and challenges that people can face when they're trying to heal and they're trying to take care of themselves and they're trying to take care of someone else. I also wanted to touch a little bit on one of these points here, which is the partner's mental health and their addiction. So if we think to the beginning of the relationship, you know, the relationship typically was entered because there was love to start, and there was a connection. And abuse typically starts to evolve and show up over time. It doesn't always necessarily start right from the beginning. And so in some cases, there's mental health concerns from the person who's behaving abusively, in many cases, I would say, and often struggles with addiction. So there is that compassion from the person who was abused, from the survivor, for their partner, because there's that depth of love and empathy that they have for the other person as well. So knowing that if they leave, the impact that may have on them as well, if they're struggling with their own mental health and their addiction, and especially if children are involved, you know, this is someone who's the parent to their child, so they do care. So I just wanted to put this quote up here because I really find it impactful, and just to leave you with something for tonight. I'm going to speak on Camino supports in a moment, but if you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 ingredients to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in the petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. So I just encourage you, if you are supporting, or you know someone who is in an abusive relationship, or you suspect they may be, to approach that with empathy and care and concern, and try to understand all of these barriers and all these reasons why people do stay. So what can we do? What can you do to help? What can we do at Camino? I did want to point out this website here. I really find it very helpful for you if you're concerned about another person that you care about. This is Neighbors, Friends, and Family, which is produced by the University of Western. And this is an online training. It's free. So it has some great videos, some great information, how you can support someone that you're concerned about. And it's completely accessible on their website. And I believe Reagan has these links, and we'll share these as well. And then at Camino, so we offer supports, very broad supports, but we do have some very specific gender-based violence supports, which I'm going to touch on here. All of these can be found on our website. I linked this specific landing page for the gender-based violence supports here. And folks can access support through us by contacting our intake team, our wayfinding team, and they help with service navigation. So they can complete an intake, but they can really help connect people with the right support and the right service. So we really think of our supports in the experience of abuse on a continuum. So we think first of prevention, early intervention. And so we have relationship supports, and then we move on towards people who are in an abusive relationship, who've left an abusive relationship and are healing, or recognize that they're maybe in an unhealthy relationship. So when it comes to relationship supports in particular, this is kind of that preventative lens. This is that early intervention lens that Amy really talked about as well, with our hope that we can maybe intervene before it becomes abusive. And we can do this through individual, couples, and family counseling. We also have something called single session quick access counseling. So that's like walk-in counseling, where people can come in on our hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays, 12 to 6. Folks can walk in and they can speak with a counselor. I will say now that finances are never a barrier to accessing our supports. So our intake will work with people, and we have many subsidies available of ways of helping folks who've experienced abuse access support. So we have many groups and workshops. I'll just touch briefly. The supports for survivors are quite similar. I do want to point out that we do have some very specific intimate partner violence groups for survivors, and that we also have 2S LGBTQIA supports from our OK2B team, as well as newcomer supports, where we have interpretation available. Amy spoke on the Family Violence Project, so I will leave that there, but we are a member of the Family Violence Project. And then this is just the last website I would love to share with all of you for if you're looking for who does this work, who else. We try to work very closely with community partners, and the Domestic Violence Service Coordination Committee is a committee of 20 members across the Waterloo region that do this work. So this website's very helpful. All these partners are listed there and the work that they do, as well as many resources for people who've maybe experienced abuse.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's interesting, the whole concept of stigma, because we see that a lot of times in drug strategy issues and other things, and stigma here too. It's almost like that sense of failure in a relationship or what have you. But and thanks for pointing out that. But I just want to ask, there was a question in here from Yumiko. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, which I thought was interesting, and I wanted to direct to you. And it's a question in what is being done in your field to maximize cultural competency and accessibility of support for members of the BIPOC community in Waterloo region. So, cultural issues, that sort of thing. Can you are you able to touch on that through your work with Camino?
Absolutely. Yeah, Yumiko, it's a really very important point because we know that people's experiences, depending on their culture, are very different. So we certainly do have a diverse range of counselors available, and we try to accommodate. When people go through an intake, we do screen and ask if they're open or they're interested in sharing anything about their gender, their faith, or their culture, so that if that's important for them, that we can try to pair them with a counselor that would meet that need. And then our newcomer wellbeing and mental health program, in particular, can support people of all races and minorities, but also those who are refugees and newcomers to Canada. And we try to offer interpretation services. And we try to work with our grassroots organizations as well. So if we couldn't meet those needs and there was a need, then we would certainly refer out and do our best to help connect people with the appropriate support.
Important issues, and important for people to know that there is services available for them. I'd like to just call on my colleague, Colleen James, my regional counselor colleague. Colleen James, we were speaking about this recently, and one of the things that was noted too in the chat was some comment about recent provincial or federal funding, and money is such an important part of all of this in terms of finding funding for what have you. And I just asked Colleen if she's still with us. I know it's kind of late. Oh, there she is.
Thank you all. This has been very, very informative. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing and continue to do. It's an epidemic. So I'm just going to speak briefly. Thank you, Rob, for just giving me some grace and space for a few minutes. Because this is a holistic systems approach to this. There is advocacy. I'll speak to some of the work that's being done in conversations that I am part of, kind of behind the scenes. I know, Jen, you and I have spoken in the summer. There was a delegation with all, well, not all, but many elected officials from municipalities who were also declaring gender-based violence and intimate partner violence an epidemic. So we've been having conversations with ministers in the province around advocacy, specifically from an AMO perspective, Association of Municipalities Ontario, advocating for a concrete plan of action with clear implementation and accountability mechanisms. Things move quickly. So that announcement yesterday, I think, was the joint between the feds and the province. The day before, I was part of a session with the Minister of the Solicitor General and the Attorney General, just advocating to address, not only to declare an epidemic, but also looking at that inquest from 2022 and the 85 actions there and what the province can do. One of the things that we're pushing for is around the reestablishment of a commission that was disbanded a few years ago. And then the other thing is around the funding. So having funding for education, I know that came up in some of the other speakers, with some of the other speakers, the education component, and not just funding, but direct to agency funding, because there will be barriers in terms of how the funding's distributed. So some of the advocacy work is around that, the data that needs to be collected, and ensuring that there's correct data coming, and just touching on some of what was mentioned before, just previously around the Black, Indigenous, racialized some of the information I was looking at didn't have any sort of disaggregated data, and the cultural nuance that's so important with this epidemic we're dealing with. So conversations continue with the province. I sit on a policing task force. We had a joint social justice policy task force meeting, just advocating. Jen, sometimes you get the random emails from me asking for information. So, I just wanted to say that there is advocacy happening for more accountability. And I know, David, you spoke about the education around the judges. So we've also recognized and been really pulling for the changes that need to happen in terms of just our justice system and how that is dealt with the Crown Attorney and all of that. So some work. Just wanted to provide a little bit of the other perspective to know, so that that there is advocacy happening. And the realities is, every single municipality in this province is dealing with this and navigating it. And then the other nuance with us as well is because of the rural townships and areas, and there's a whole dynamic with that, with getting those who are experiencing to come forward because of the rural nuance. So that's all I kind of have to say for now, but there is work being done, and again, reinforcing the education piece and investment in the transitional housing piece as well.
Thanks, Colleen. I think it's important for people to know that members of our council, regional council, and area municipalities are out there taking advantage of opportunities when they can get in front of a minister or a member to advocate for more resources to raise awareness of this issue. Because right now, municipalities and social agencies like the ones here are bearing the brunt of this frontline work. And that's where we need that extra effort and support from the province on this. And hopefully they'll start to turn their attention to this. I'm just going to mention something. And then if anyone has any questions amongst the group here, anyone that's been watching, feel free to raise your hand. Happy to call on you and you can ask a question for the group. But I see Lynn has posted some information about the Pink Brain Pledge in the chat line there. So certainly that's, very interesting. And something that some people may want to take a look at. So much as in the area of brain injury, especially after Sidney Crosby and the injuries that he suffered, has just raised the whole overall awareness of concussion and the impact and the serious impact of concussion overall. Okay.
Rob, can I just jump in quickly and tack on after your Sidney Crosby comment?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So for every one NHL hockey player who will suffer a concussion on the ice playing the game that he loves, 4,500 women will be exposed to probable brain injury as a result of exposure to intimate partner violence.
That's
so one compared to 4,500.
Massive. Yeah, that's massive. Yeah, huge. I mean, that's just mind-boggling, those sorts of numbers.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see Charlotte. Go ahead, Charlotte. You have your hand up and you've posted some interesting questions in the chat. Feel free.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm a 20-year professional engineer for manufacturing, and kind of last decade been looking more into social issues. And as a database decision maker, it's almost like offensive, the level of research done to research the trend in going into the negative or negative deltas, so to speak. So the United Nations of Women states that the number one barrier to harassment culture, which I would say we're there, is safe reporting. Of your organizations, I'm proposing putting together like a federal level one reporting system that goes through nonprofits, sexual assault centers, all the wonderful tapestry that's going on across Canada, and not through university and institutions. Like the University of Western had 70% harassment reporting in 2019. So we'll be going to one platform. So I'm not about segregating data, all one platform, a platform that's similar, maybe a Vista Sit, which is a online reporting process. But it would be going through your trusted organizations, right? Proven, integrated, trained, been working in social services for a long time, but absolutely not towards the police stations. And
Okay,
not towards businesses.
okay, so Charlotte, maybe you could reach out to some of the people here and share some more of what it is you're working on and see if there's any connections that way. So thank you very much for sharing that information. Much appreciated. We'll end it at that. Again, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time. You can see they put a lot of time and effort and energy into their presentations, and that's very much appreciated. And I want to thank everyone that's been with us throughout this whole process. And stay tuned. Reach out if you feel so moved to want to help some of the organizations you see here. While funding is always appreciated in any amount, your time and assistance and having actual people volunteer is also very important too, and we don't talk about that enough. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us tonight, and take care and be safe.